I can just keep talking. This is, when I see this, I'm gonna like just keep going. And so that's some of the work that Powwow Pitch does. I started this project because I went on Dragon's Den like 13 years ago on a whim because someone said, you should go on this show. And I was like, I should. And so I was very, oh, you're cutting me off after 30 seconds? Well, I'm getting mixed messages here. I'm saying keep going, and I'm saying, who am I listening to? Them. Okay, good. We're good. Okay, so I'll tell you the story about why I started Powwow Pitch later when we need a little break, and the Dragon's Den story. So up next, we'd like to introduce Adam Fiser, Associate Director for the Conference Board of Canada. Please come on up. Give Adam Oh, he's virtual. Hi, Adam. There you are.
Hey, Samantha.
Take it away, Adam.
Love your energy. Thank you. So hello, everyone. This morning, I'll be presenting on a project the Conference Board is currently undertaking for NACA. I'm just having a little trouble advancing the slide for some reason. Please bear with me. There we go. Apologies for that. So I'm presenting on a project the Conference Board is currently undertaking for NACA. I'd have loved to join you in person, but I unfortunately tested positive for COVID late last week. So thanks to the kind folks on the NACA team, I can at least take part virtually as I self-isolate from home. So back to the purpose at hand. This project is about estimating the economic and social impacts of what we're calling the AFI ecosystem. The ecosystem includes AFI loans, as well as non-repayable contributions, other commercial debt, and client equity. Using 5 years of data about the total investments made through this ecosystem, our objectives are twofold. First, we set out to estimate a set of national indicators for direct, indirect, and induced economic impacts, and this includes GDP, employment, and wages. This work is now largely complete, and I'll report on some high-level results today. Our second objective is to estimate social impacts linked to the data and relevant theory on social determinants. We're currently looking at income security, food security, housing, and health and well-being. This part of our work is in progress, and today I'll present on some early results about our modeling of income and food security. We're also developing a series of case studies to illustrate insights from the modeling work we're doing. We're currently interviewing representatives of different AFIs to learn about the economic and social impacts you see in your communities. If you'd like to participate, there's still time, and I'd encourage you to reach out through NACA after the conference. So to help you understand what we're actually modeling, I want to start with a few descriptions of the core data set we're working with. This is a representation of the AFI ecosystem, including the investments that flow through it and the types of industries and communities those investments contribute to. In terms of industries, from 2016 to 2021, 50% of AFI-directed investments were concentrated in 3 industry sectors. These are retail trade, agriculture, forestry, fishing and hunting, and accommodation and food services. Other heavily weighted sectors include construction and transportation and warehousing. Now, from the industry side, we turn to the community side. Here we see that 46% of AFI-directed investments went to on-reserve businesses. The remaining 54% went off-reserve, and mainly to urban businesses, which took up about 1/3 of total investment, followed by rural and remote. Another way we look at the community side is through what's called the Community Wellbeing Index. This is a way of ranking communities based on 4 interrelated development indicators, including education, employment, income, and housing. The index is based on the United Nations Human Development Index, and it was developed by researchers with support from what's now ISC and Statistics Canada. I can't go into all the fine points that come with the Community Wellbeing Index today, but I will use it in the next few slides to help you think about the kinds of impacts that AFIs have on community economic development. The first thing to understand is where AFI client communities rank along the index. The index itself goes from 0 to 100. 100 equals the highest levels of education, employment, income, and housing quality captured by the index. 50 serves as a kind of cutoff point between developing and underdeveloped communities. We'll look at a few examples to see what this means. First though, the slide we're looking at provides average community well-being scores for AFI client communities. Here we see that on reserve, scores an average of 15 points lower than off reserve, while small remote reserves score among the lowest and on par with some small remote Arctic communities. While the average reserve in the AFI ecosystem scored a 63, a client community like Wendake scored an 80, which is ahead of the off-reserve average. So let's keep using Wendake as an example to look under the hood of what's driving its community well-being score. We'll also compare it to a couple of other communities in the AFI ecosystem, including Whitecap, Dakota, and a small remote First Nation that represents the lower end of the Community Wellbeing Index. The numbers we're looking at here are from the 2016 census for registered members of these communities. Comparing Wendake to Whitecap, we see that incomes and housing conditions are fairly similar. Their main difference seems to be around the level of post-secondary graduates. Both communities get profiled quite a bit for the economic successes they have achieved, and their community well-being scores reflect that. Now, if we compare Wendake to the small remote First Nation, which is the column over on the right, we see some very noticeable differences. The 40-point gap between these communities in terms of their well-being scores is most noticeable around levels of education and housing quality. The small community barely has any high school graduates, and over 50% of its homes are in need of major repairs. We also see that average income in the small remote community is almost half that of Wendake's. While these are vastly different realities, they reflect the diversity of client communities served by the AFI ecosystem. So using something like the Community Wellbeing Index can help AFIs and their partners keep track of these differences and identify gaps in development. So this will be my last slide on the CWB index. It's about community economic development. Here we see that the majority of AFI client communities improved their scores by at least 6 points between 1996 and 2016. Based on ISK's research, much of this growth on reserve is tied to rising post-secondary graduation rates and incomes. In the reserve context, we see that 30% of communities gained fewer than 6 points or potentially declined. But we also see a larger proportion of communities that improved between 16 and 20 points. On the slide, you'll see the flags up, and these are AFI client communities like Whitecap or Fort McKay or Enoch Cree First Nation. And in the off-reserve context, it's communities like Old Crow, the Vuntut Gwitchin in Yukon. So what does this all mean? Well, AFIs have been around since the 80s and 90s. And some of you might know how these communities were back in 1996. And you probably know how AFI investments and support services helped give them a chance when other lenders wouldn't. If you feel like sharing any of this history, we'd love to hear from you. And most importantly, AFIs continue to work with communities that still face plenty of hurdles and barriers along their path to self-determination. A small business operating in the remote First Nation that scored a 40 on the Community Wellbeing Index doesn't have many options for startup funding. The work you do is therefore vital on so many different levels of economic development. You were there before the stars took off, and you're here now supporting the communities in greatest need. I'll now turn to the bigger picture of development captured by our economic impact assessment. Here we look at total investments flowing through the AFI ecosystem, including AFI lending, non-repayable contributions, other commercial lending, and client equity. This approach allows us to estimate national level impacts on GDP, employment, and wages. It also provides a useful framework for exploring patterns in Indigenous developmental finance, allowing us to investigate the total impact an AFI loan can have on the Canadian economy. In terms of the high-level results, from 2016 to 2021, the total investment of $795 million flowing through the AFI ecosystem had a total GDP impact of more than $876 million. This means that for every dollar AFI is lent, the economy produced $3.60 in total GDP. That's quite a big multiplier. The total investment also had a total employment impact of more than 12,100 full-time jobs and a total wage impact of more than $514 million. Now, these results are stronger than those we reported back in 2017 in our work for NACA and BDC, when we had a more limited data set. Interestingly, that AFI multiplier effect is almost identical. Again, speaking to the vital role that AFIs play in matching loans with other lenders, non-repayable contributions, and client equity. AFIs are the glue. It's the work they do that keeps the ecosystem delivering these kinds of impacts. I'll now turn to the second phase of our research to estimate social impacts associated with AFI-directed investments. Our assessment of the AFI ecosystem's social impacts interprets the best available data from NACA with help from Statistics Canada's Indigenous-focused survey research, census data, alongside work from the First Nations Information Governance Centre, and research on the social determinants of health and well-being. Theory on the social determinants of health and well-being links employment and income levels to well-being and health outcomes. We apply this theory to model social impacts. This approach allows us to make reasonable inferences about national level impacts and provides a useful framework for exploring the social impacts of AFI-directed investments on issues such as income and food security, housing, health, and mental well-being. This slide represents what we think is a key driver of impacts in the AFI ecosystem. What it shows is the average income for Indigenous people working in the industries and communities that AFIs invest in. That average income not only exceeds the average income for Indigenous people in Canada, but it also slightly exceeds the average income for non-Indigenous people. Closing that $10,000 gap between average Indigenous and non-Indigenous income levels contributes to greater income security and food security. This bears out in the modeling that we've undertaken. Continuing on from the previous slide, we created a model of income and food security for Indigenous peoples based on several Statistics Canada surveys that have large samples of rural, remote, and urban Indigenous populations, including the Aboriginal People Survey, or what's now called the Indigenous People Survey, and the Canadian Community Health Survey. We believe this works very well for off-reserve populations. For on-reserve populations, we have insights from the First Nations Information Governance Centre, as well as academic and published community-based research. The surveys and research help shape our assumptions about the ways employment and income affect food security. Questions from both the Aboriginal People Survey and the Canadian Community Health Survey, for example, directly ask respondents about their employment status and levels of income, and whether they were able to afford quality food or deal with unexpected surprises that would have impacted their savings, for example. Now, this is a simplification of all the different research components that feed into our final model, but it should give you the gist of what we're after here. Once we feed the distribution of incomes tied to AFI-directed investments, we get an outline of what impact these investments have for a person who might otherwise have been unemployed. In a nutshell, 82% of Indigenous workers modeled in the AFI investment scenario would report high or medium food security, while 70% of unemployed people from similar backgrounds would have done the same. In other words, the AFI directed investments help reduce food insecurity from a proportion of 30% down to 18%. Now, this work is ongoing, and we're looking forward to providing further insights from the models as the research evolves. But we're also doing additional work on social impacts, which is ongoing. A growing body of international research and theory suggests that growth in income and employment improves average levels of self-reported health and mental well-being, especially for people in lower income brackets. We're currently testing models based on the Canadian Community Health Survey, Indigenous Peoples Survey, and data from the First Nations Information Governance Center. I also have to give a shout out to our colleagues at IBC and Terrapin, who are doing some really inspiring work in Alberta, and hopefully they'll get a chance to present some of the work that they're currently working on with respect to social impact measures in their annual reporting for IBC, that is. Now, the theory of social determinants also suggests that growth in income and employment contributes to improved housing conditions, especially off-reserve. We're currently testing models based on census, Indigenous Peoples Survey, and First Nations Information Governance Center data in this regard. On-reserve housing conditions may be more difficult to model, but we're following several important leads tied to Statistics Canada's work on core housing needs with CMHC. We're looking forward to sharing some of these insights as we get deeper into this part of the work. In closing, I want to remind you again that we are currently interviewing AFIs to learn more about the impacts you see in your communities. This information will be used to develop several case studies to illustrate and enrich the estimates from our modeling work. What we've heard so far reveals a social side to AFI work that goes well beyond incremental measures and developmental indexes. AFIs continue to break social barriers and social stereotypes that impede Indigenous entrepreneurship. They build relationships with their clients and work to instill trust and self-esteem. They help communities realize visions of better futures, and they help grow the next generation of entrepreneurs and community leaders in communities that stand to benefit the most. In other words, this is community economic development work, and it deserves a spotlight. So thank you for your time, and please reach out after the conference if you'd like to share your insights with us. Looks like I have plenty of time for questions, so if you'd like to chat about anything, remain online and be happy to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So next we're going to have a health break, which is going to be a little bit extended here. And so feel free to go out, stretch, move, and we're going to come back here at 11 a.m. Thank you.